I think in retrospect it is a classic album. U2 would go on to make better albums over time, but it was a very significant album for them.
In terms of U2's oeuvre, it's definitely up there. And I think, however grudging you might be to acknowledge U2 as a force to be reckoned with, I think War is proof that they really were.
Why the War album is important is because in it, Bono shakes off the young, the children, adolescent thing. So there's less subconscious, I've got to be young and whooping and yelling, and there's much, the weight of the world is beginning to drop on his shoulder.
There's always going to be a gap in the market for a fantastic rock band with great songs. You know, there's the old record business maxim, you know, art for art's sake, hit singles for fuck's sake.
I was standing in the marquee watching U2. It's probably one of the first big gigs they did in London, and it was by then sold out and packed, and I was leaning against a pillar and next to me was Bruce Springsteen, who'd come along to check him out, and I never met him before or since, but I was like, all right, Bruce, you know, I'd seen him at Wembley quite recently, and nice gig, what do you think? You know, they're going to be huge in America, words to that effect, and he was right.
I first came across U2 in 1979, I think. I was working at CBS Records as an A&R department, that's now Sony Records. And Paul McGuinness used to come to London on a regular basis with a suitcase full of tapes of all sorts of songs and bands and stuff from Dublin, trying to get deals on them. And he used to come and see me. Came to see me a couple of times, and each time he came, one of the tapes he'd pull out would be of this new group that he'd got, this new teenage group that he'd got, who he said were doing, you know, great things in Ireland. And they won a CBS Ireland talent competition, and he told me about that, and the photographs looked good, and I said I'd go over and see them play in Dublin. Bono was fantastic. We saw them in a little club where half their audience couldn't get in because there was an age restriction. So the place was only half full, and Paul McGuinness was most apologetic about this. So anyway, they came on, and as a band they were a fairly ordinary new wave post-punk band. They weren't special as a group, but Bono was absolutely mesmerising. He had loads of stagecraft. He had lots of presence, and then he was jumping and running all over the stage. And in particular, he was doing a lot of classical, tragic hero type acting sort of things, like out of Shakespeare and stuff. In fact, he reminded me, when I was at university, I saw Ian McKellen, a young Ian McKellen, doing some Jacobean tragedy, and Bono had all of those moves and all that kind of presence. And I remember saying to Howard that, shouting in his ear as you do at a gig, that either this guy is going to be, he's either going to be a new sensational Alex Harvey, or he's going to be a new David Bowie. He's going to be one or the other. It's going to be big but not for long, or it's going to be big and it might be forever.
During my time at Zigzag, I built up a good relationship with the Island Records press office. Rob Partridge was always fixing me up with interviews, and one day he told me I could do this interview with Bob Marley that I'd been plugging away for a long time. Rob said, well, you could do me a favour. We've signed a band called U2, and do you want to go over there and do them for Zigzag? That would be, you know, it was kind of like a trade. I said, yeah, sure. So as a favour to Rob, who apparently had been a massive champion for U2, he was probably mainly thanks to him they got signed to Ireland. Rob had heard a demo very early on, and he'd been badgering the rest of the company, sign this band U2, and they did. And I went over to Dublin, I met them. Bono met me at the airport, and with Paul McGuinness, and I had 2 days with U2, and they were very nice. And they took me up to what they called the Gingerbread House, which is where they rehearsed. And I saw them rehearsing up that 11 o'clock TikTok and all those early songs. And then we went to the pub for a pint of Guinness, and I had my first blast of Bono's theories of rock and roll, society, everything. And I thought, this band have got something. And obviously, they did.
I'm certain that I discerned something special about them. They had a different take, you know, and they sort of had a different philosophy about it all. You know, they were staunchly you know, 2-3 years after the event, they were bought into the punk thing, but somehow or other for all the idealistic reasons. You know, they were definitely they were anti-drugs, they were anti-posing, they were. Bono was particularly keen that they shouldn't, you know, sing about the same sorts of things that all other bands sing about, and he wanted to deal with things about sort of personal feelings and stuff. And the first couple of albums are all, if you look at 90% of the songs, are all dealing with, you know, Bono being the lyricist, of course, and so therefore voicing what the song's about. They're all about the individual trying to stand up and find his feet, you know. And then as their work goes on, they moved into broader themes, but they were much more introverted in their subject matter in the first 2-3 albums. Certainly the first 2 albums. They were really focused on the experience of being a child and being an early adolescent. The songs were all, and they were different in that respect. You know, they weren't about dole cues, and they weren't about, you know, the sort of stuff the Clash was singing about, or the Stranglers were singing about. They weren't world weary at all. They were very sort of fresh and I guess in retrospect spiritual, which is something obviously they developed later on. But that sort of feeling was in there, you know, from the beginning.
I think War was the album that was the crossover for U2 really, because they started in 1981 with Boy, and it's a very kind of naive album. I mean, they've just had the teens, they're basically just stopped being teenagers, and it's very kind of raw, quite visceral, quite angry, but they hadn't really found a way to express the anger yet. It was quite unformed, quite inarticulate in some ways. And then they came out with October the next year, which was really kind of more the same, but not quite as, it didn't really work as well. It was a bit of a sort of step backwards, if anything. So with War was the first time they really sounded quite coherent and had a message, had something to say, and seemed capable of putting it across in a convincing fashion.
U2 were in trouble at that time, very much so. They were hugely, they went into making the album hugely in debt to Ireland. With October, their second album, they'd seriously thought about chucking it in, and The Edge has subsequently said that he had wondered whether he might quit the band. So that was the real problem. They were undecided. It was a really kind of stressful time for them. So the fact that they came out with such a forceful statement, and really their first great record, is quite a testament to their talent, I think, and to the, you know, their strength as individuals and as a band.
War got to #1 really on the strength of the hardcore fan base that they built up over the previous 2 albums and the tours that they'd undertaken. They had an incredibly loyal following at that point, and that following was enough to take the album to #1, where it actually displaced Michael Jackson's Thriller, which in itself is some kind of statement.
I think it's more a kind of refining the style that was hinted at on the first 2 albums, really. I mean, given the way that U2 have developed, and they're kind of chameleon-like, they've constantly evolved over the years, I think it's easy to forget that they were essentially a post-punk band when they emerged, and so there are kind of echoes of Echo and the Bunnymen, Susie and the Banshees, Joy Division. That's the sort of sound that they were coming from, but they did something much more with it. They made it much more declamatory and uplifting, and message-laden, less introspective, more outgoing.
Just before they recorded War, they took the unusual step of actually doing quite a lengthy tour of Britain, Ireland and some parts of Europe, where they were experimenting with a lot of the material that was going to be on the finished album. With War, they realised this was their big opportunity to get all the things right that they hadn't got right with the first 2 albums. They had more money to record, they had more time to record, and it was taken much more seriously by the record company. They were now an established band in Britain, at least, with hits behind them. So the whole idea was that War would be the album that broke them internationally, which is exactly what happened. So they took it much more seriously, took much more time, and they toured before the album, so that by the time they came to the studio to record the stuff, A, they were hot off the road. You know, there's a real difference between a group that's just come straight from a 2-month tour into a studio to a group that's even been rehearsing for a few weeks. There's a completely different ambience, a different vibe, a different proficiency, a different attitude. They're absolutely ready to rock, as they say. They also are much more familiar with the material, much more confident, and much more convinced about their abilities, and much less hung up about, are we punk? Well, we're Irish punk. Well, what is Irish punk? That can never compete with what's going on in London and Manchester. Okay, we've done that. What do we do with the second album? Well, it's got to be a bit like, you know, all that stuff went completely out the window, and it was like, what are we going to do? Let's go in there and absolutely make this amazing.
Well, actually, The Edge went into studios in Dublin by himself because the rest of the band were on holiday. Bono was on his honeymoon in the Bahamas, and The Edge went into Winmore Lane Studios in Dublin with a 4-track and started messing around by himself. And it was actually him who came up. He roughed out the first shapes for New Year's Day by himself, for example. And even wrote the first lyric, although that was subsequently dumped. But it came out of, essentially it came out of The Edge's sort of preparatory work. And I think the fact that they'd hardened their resolve at the end of October, when it really did look like 3 of the members might opt for a religious life rather than a rock and roll life, because they saw serious conflict between the two. And the fact that they'd made a conscious decision to stick with their music and make that their life. That's one of the things I think that made War so enormously focused and successful and strong.
When you first played Sunday, Bloody Sunday in Belfast, you asked the audience permission really to sing it and approve of it, which is highly unusual for any kind of a band, much less a rock and roll band. Why'd you do that?
We made a mistake. We might have not walked out there alive.
I think we needed to feel their approval in a sense of what the song said. We knew that our audience that night was a mixture of Protestant and Catholic, and within the group it's the same. What that song says is something that goes against the grain of what a lot of people in Northern Ireland really believe. And it was a test in a sense of the loyalty of the audience that night. And sure enough, some people just left immediately when we made the announcement about the song and what it was about. But I think 98% of the people that were there thought that it had to be said, and they really approved of it.
Give me a thumbnail sketch of what the song is about so that I can illustrate it.
Sunday, Bloody Sunday?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not even sure if we got it right. You know, we may have got that song wrong, because what I tried to, with the words, I tried to contrast Easter Sunday with Sunday, Bloody Sunday. Sunday, Bloody Sunday was a day, there's 2 days that are called Sunday, Bloody Sunday. One back at the turn of the century, 1913 or so, which was a massacre in Dublin, in a stadium called Croke Park, by the Black and Tans, which were a British designed paramilitary unit that took their vengeance on the Irish people by just spraying bullets into a football crowd. The second, and the one that I wrote about, was in Ulster and Derry, where at a civil rights march, paratroopers shot dead 13 innocent people unarmed. And here was this Protestant Catholic war, and I tried to point out the hypocrisy of that, and the hypocrisy of the fact that both religions had the same basic roots in Easter Sunday. And that's what I tried to contrast in the song. I'm not sure if I did that successfully.
Both of those events involved the killing of a dozen or more innocent civilians by armed forces. They were horrific events, and they've scarred the Irish psyche, both of them. U2 did not address either of these Bloody Sundays directly, but they knew what the phrase meant. They knew what a loaded expression Bloody Sunday is. in Ireland, but they deliberately took it away from the specifics and into a general condemnation of sectarian violence, the unrelenting cycle of sectarian violence that has dragged Ireland down for so long.